Yes, that was my husband.
Now I know it. Make sure I know.
Good morning, Marlene.
How are you?
Very good, and you? Hey, Gwen. How are you? Hi, how are you, Rose?
10 o'clock.
Nice to see you.
It'll be on YouTube.
I have already read the
Hi, Dana. How are you?
Well, that's what you said.
Yes, that's what I would like to
Oh,
say.
you look so awesome this time.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Okay, so the most important thing is my Shalom coffee mug, so I keep get a little caffeine. Boker Tov, everybody. Good morning. Boker. So Boker Tov means good morning, and the reply is Boker or Boker with light. So Boker Tov. So congratulations, everybody, on beginning this journey, and the destination is actually going to be up to everyone. If I want to say this again because this is how we began this discussion. If you want to have a bat mitzvah, whether that be as a joint class, individually, with a friend, like a pair or whatever, great. The most important thing is that, as we talked about the first time, is that I think everybody feels a little bit, you're sort of Jewish, but there's certain questions or certain things that you may not know. And my job is to try to fill in the gaps. And that is part of what any bar or bat mitzvah learns, is to ask questions. So I don't want anybody to feel that, that there's any question that's out of the box or any challenge that's out of the box. Because I need to tell you that as much as we think that there are traditions and there are things that we're supposed to do, most of Judaism is a construct of the rabbis. The rabbis make things up to be congruent with the people of the time. Okay? In fact, there are books that are put out lately that says, disobey the Torah. For example, I'll give you an example. It says in the Torah, if you have a son who is misbehaving,
Take him to the gates.
take him to the gates and, no, close, stone him, and stone him to death. Okay? Now, as much as we all sometimes want to take our kids, and we would consider that for a half a second, that's not what we do. And the rabbis say, disobey the Torah. In other words, we live in a rabbinical, Judaism is a rabbinical religion. It is not a biblical religion. So, for example, as the Christian person will say to you, what about Isaiah 53, 1, 10 to 10? You know, Jewish people, how many people can quote scripture here? Okay. How many can't, by the way? Okay, I can name you in the beginning. I think I know where the 10 Commandments are, I think. I could quote that. And I think there's one or two that I know begin a chapter, but generally everything we do is a what we call rabbinical interpretation. That means that it's very democratic, and this is where I want to begin. I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson this morning, and I'm going to tell you why women have not been allowed to do very much in Judaism in recent times, and why we think that that's incorrect. Now, it's just not my opinion. We're going to go to a piece of the Talmud which tells us why, logically and intellectually, we are going to overrule some of the older rabbinical traditions from Poland and from Russia and from all these other places. But I want to give you a very quick history lesson, first of all, of Judaism. And secondly, I'm going to use phrases like the Talmud, the Mishnah, and some of you have been through this before, but I'm going to go through this very quickly. I don't want anybody to feel that anything that I'm saying is not something that you get 100%. And if you don't, then you raise your hand and you ask me the question. The Cantor and I feel very strongly that one of the reasons why people have drifted so far from Judaism is it feels a lot of the times like there's these secret dances and secret handshakes and stand up, sit down, and do this, do that. And people don't know, and they feel that it's their inadequacy that they haven't learned it properly or whatever. And I'm going to tell you, I don't think it's always been taught properly. So this is why we're a little bit different here. Any questions so far? Raise thine hands if there's a... Yes? Wonderful.
You're going to be sorry you asked.
No, I am absolutely not. I am absolutely not.
So if it's okay for a rabbi to tell you to ignore the Torah or don't do this thing in the Torah, why do we keep repeating in the liturgy that we love the Torah and it is the path to peace when it's all about war and nastiness?
So it feels like it's sometimes about war, and it feels sometimes like it's about nastiness. But if we had a debate one day, back and forth, the goodness and the compassion and the kindness outweighs overwhelmingly. It's just that the war sticks in our kishkas so badly that, and we'll talk about the authorship of the Torah another time, but I'll tell you up front that it is my belief that the Torah was not written by God, that the Torah was inspired by God, and the first hard copy of the Torah, it only shows up approximately 23 or 2,400 years ago. That's 1,000 years after the Exodus, when the prophet Ezra shows up after a little time in Babylon and shows up with the hard copy that is the first copy of the Torah that we had. There's Mount Sinai. Nice picture of Mount Sinai there. Okay, 3,400 years ago we received the Ten Commandments, but the first hard copy shows up 2,300 years ago. And there are many who have analyzed the Torah through linguistic computers and voices and grammar. They find 5 or 6 voices, linguistic voices in the Torah, and one of them may have been a woman. So
You mean sentence structure?
Sentence structure. For example, names of God, sometimes Elohim, right? Sometimes Adonai, right? Yud-He, Vav-He. And what we notice, what's likely happening, I'm wondering a little bit, but what likely happened was that at the time of David and Solomon, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, excuse me, there was the northern 10 tribes, which we now call the lost tribes, right? The 10 tribes, they were called Israel. There were 2 Jewish countries. One of them was Israel, and one of them was Judah. The top 10 tribes lived in the north, in the Galilee. Everything there is fertile and lush. Everybody been to Israel? What's the difference between the topography around Jerusalem and the difference between the topography around in the Galilee? What's the difference? Hills around Jerusalem, right?
Trees.
Right, but when you go north, what do you notice? Dirty.
It's open and it's gorgeous.
It's gorgeous, it's green. So if you were writing the Torah from a northern perspective, a lot of it has to do with agriculture, with fertility, with lushness, with the first fruits, the trees, the vegetables. And if you're down from the north, around Jerusalem, sacrifices, temple, show up, go to shul, sit down, etc., etc. So we have 2 voices of the Torah, the northern voice and the southern voice, and modern scholarship, not your ultra-Orthodox synagogue in Borough Park, but modern conservative Reform scholarship generally says that the Torah, that Ezra, the prophet Ezra, 2,300 years ago, which is really quite recent.
It's about 278 or something, 378?
378 o'clock, thank you. Yeah, approximately between 2,400 shows up with the first hard copy of the Torah, and people start to read it where? Outside the gates of Jerusalem. So for example, where some of you had your bat mitzvahs or visited along the walls, that's where the first public reading of the Torah took place. I want to just go through a very, very quick theological thing. In the year 2038, approximately, Abraham comes into play. And every time I mention Abraham, we're going to add Sarah, because the authors generally lead with males, and we're going to fix that over time. Abraham has a different view of the world. Everybody before Abraham looked at many gods, right? The god of the sea, the god of the sun, the god of the mountains, physical gods, right? You wanted good agriculture. What do?
Right.
Pray to the god of, and maybe even if you wanted the god of fertility, some places would even, right? We know this: sacrifice children, sacrifice firstborn, sacrifice. So Abraham comes up with a concept. He is seen as the father of monotheism, an invisible God. That's where we all come from, right? The invisible, the people that worship the invisible God. And I'm sorry, I'll give you very quickly the Idols Are Us story, which basically says that Abraham had a father named Terah who had a idol store, and Abraham, Terah goes off to town. He says, "You're going to look after my store." Abraham starts knocking down all the idols with an axe, and just as the father comes back over the hill, he puts the axe into the last one that's standing, the Muhammad Ali statue, the only one that's left. And the father comes back and says, "No, what did you do?" He says, "Well, he did it, the idol over there." And Terah says, "What are you talking about? These are just idols." And Abraham says, "Then why are you selling them to people?" So that's what they call a midrash. Do I think that happened? I'm not sure. Doesn't say so in the Torah, but a midrash is a story. A midrash is a nice little story that we tell in Judaism. Let's not get too stuck with stories to think that they really happened. It's a way for rabbis to teach us a lesson. Abraham has a son named Isaac, also Ishmael. They have a son named Jacob. We won't go through the whole Torah right now. And Jacob has 12 sons and one daughter. And the 12 sons, during time of famine, approximately, let's do some math here. Let's just say it's about, let's give him 50 years or 60 years. So let's say in the 1900s BCE. Everybody know what that means?
Before the Common Era.
Why don't we say BC?
Because we don't say before
Because we have to
Christ.
believe in C before there can be a BC, right? So we say BCE or CE instead of AD, which is, what's it?
Anno Domini.
Okay, and we don't have a dominant, so we say CE. Okay. Jacob has 12 sons, and they get hungry. So they all go to Egypt, where they try to find food. Guess who's waiting for them? Joseph. What's the story of Joseph? Everybody remember the story of Joseph? What happens to him? They abandoned. Not only did they abandon him,
They threw him in a pit.
threw him in a pit, right? And he gets up and he ends up in Egypt. And sure enough, when these guys come there looking for food, who's there? Joseph's waiting for them. Baruch Hashem, bless God, because this is all put in motion by God, says our tradition, or it was just the way that the story works. We're in Egypt for approximately 400 years, and the first person to name us as a people is a guy by the name of Pharaoh. There are 12 tribes. Here's Egypt. We're up in this little corner. This is Israel. And we're called in a place called Goshen. And the Pharaoh says, "I'm looking around at the sons of Israel." The word for sons is B'nai, the sons of Yisrael. B'nai Yisrael, the sons of Israel. That's Jacob's nickname. And that's the first time that we are named as a people. We didn't name ourselves as a people.
Is that written down?
Yeah. It's written down that they rose a Pharaoh in Egypt that did not know Joseph and everything that he had done for Egypt. And he looked around and said, "I'm looking at the sons of Israel, and they are too many and too powerful, and we need to do something with them, lest they align themselves with some of our enemies." The first time we are named as a collective in history is by Pharaoh, not by the Jews. But from that point on, now we're all in this together. Right, 12 tribes. Israel. Jacob's nickname, Jacob's second name is Israel, which means wrestler with God. Thank you. Welcome to Judaism. Okay. We wrestle with God. Yes?
What were the two southern tribes called?
The two southern tribes were, just a minute, Judah and, I'm blanking here, Judah and Levi. The top ones, the 10 lost tribes, I don't want to do too much on history today, but in 2,700 years ago, Assyria comes down from the north, scoops up the northern tribes and their wonderful plush land around Sfat and Tiberias and takes them away, and we are then reduced to Jerusalem and area, which is basically where we've been for most of our history. So let's go to Joseph, we go to slavery, and now we have somebody called Moses. Moses leads us out of the desert, right? We're about to come up to Passover. I'm doing a very quick history, and we'll get to what about mitzvahs in a minute. And we end up 3,400 years ago at the base of Mount Sinai. Okay. Now,
Which is where on your map?
I don't have a map.
Yes, you do. You just took one.
This one here or that one there?
No.
That's Mount Sinai.
Underneath.
Here?
You made Egypt and you made...
So Mount Sinai is somewhere in the Sinai Desert. We don't know exactly where it is. There are tours that are given in the Sinai by very enterprising tour guides. There's even a monastery on the top, but in reality we don't know where Mount Sinai... And by the way, I'm not sure that it's that important that we do. 3,400 years ago, there was lightning and there was thunder, and all of a sudden, it's almost like the Jewish people were dating God through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses. We were getting to know each other a little bit. God gets mad at us, we get mad at God, we question God, etc., etc. But as soon as we accept the Torah on Mount Sinai, that's it. We're buddies for life. We are buddies for life. We are locked in together, and it's called an unconditional covenant. God will never leave the Jewish people. Anybody want to argue with me about that one?
What do you do with the Holocaust?
So, here's the problematic thing, and we'll talk about this at another session, because the Holocaust demands a whole other theological discussion. There is the unconditional covenant, and then there is the conditional covenant. God makes an unconditional covenant with Abraham and on Mount Sinai. If you do these things, if you are good, if you are ethical, if you believe in an invisible God, if you don't sacrifice, I'm adding a little here, if you don't sacrifice human beings, if you don't worship materialism, I will be your God. And we go through almost a dating period. But in about 3,400 BCE, we accept the Torah, says our tradition, on Mount Sinai. And at that particular point, the unconditional covenant says, we are husband and wife, wife and husband, forever and ever. But there's a conditional covenant, which exists at the core of Jewish theology up to the Holocaust. Because what I'm about to tell you, the Holocaust, you can explain through this filter. If you are good, then God will be good to you. And if you mess up, and if you are, if you follow materialism, if you assimilate, right? If you take on other people's traditions, if some of you went to the Dead Sea Scroll exhibit, there was a picture of a god named Asherah. And one of the things that the Jewish people did is they said, well, why don't we have our God marry that God over there in Canaan, and we now have a husband and wife. Okay, God doesn't need a wife, but these are the examples of the way that we sort of assimilated, that we took in other Jews for Jesus almost. It's a way that you sort of take in two philosophies and try to make them into one, but they're not. All right, on Mount Sinai, we get two things. We get the written Torah, and we get the oral Torah. Written Torah. What's written Torah? 10 Commandments. Don't, don't, don't. There's a bunch of don'ts, and then there's a bunch of do's. So don'ts are Don'ts are
Don't kill people.
don't kill people, right? Don't steal.
covet.
Don't covet your neighbor's
Partner.
partner. Thank you. And the don'ts and the do's are, think about that.
Honor thy mother and father.
Honor your mother and your father. Wonderful. Observe or remember the Shabbat. All those kind of other things. You shall have no other God but me. But the most important thing that we inherit is the oral Torah. So if I say, what's that?
The oral Torah is not what we now have written down as the 5 books of Moses.
This is oral Torah.
Then where does the 5 books of Moses stand? If what we got at Mount Sinai was the 10 Commandments, when did we get the rest of them?
Moses goes up onto the mountain and receives more Torah. And we have what's called a machloket. This is a word I'm going to use quite a lot. It's a debate within Judaism. If you are a ultra-Orthodox person, you believe that all was dictated to Moses in or around the time of Mount Sinai. If you believe in a progressive Jewish approach, then you say that the Torah was actually inspired and written down at a later date. That is my philosophy. How do I know this? At the end of the Torah, it says this. And Moses died that day on Mount Nebo, and he handed the reins to Joshua, and there has never been a prophet like Moses until this very day. So, who's writing that? Because I could say I've never had,
maybe Ezra.
yeah, I've never had a class like this to this very day. Well, I don't know. And there's about 2 or 3 times in the Torah. For example, when Jacob pulls his hip, he says, that's why we don't eat the hip end of the cow until this very day.
Oh.
What is that? No, that's what it says. That's why you don't have, what is it, the T-bones? I don't know what the...
Why can't that mean forever and ever?
What's that?
That could also be interpreted as forever and ever.
They're referring to the hip quarter, but yeah. But whenever they say to this very day, it makes us think, maybe the Torah was written closer to here, inspired. But how did it get from here to here? Bubbies to children, mothers and fathers, and talk, and argument, and discourse, and all that other stuff. Yeah.
If there are so many passages or whatever that say to this very day, is there anything that says eternally, or is it just the verbalization from generation to generation?
It generally says to this day or to this very day.
So that doesn't mean forever.
No, because whoever wrote it at that particular, I'm going to give a hypothesis here that if Ezra or somebody else, or even the 2 scrolls that he's combining, the northern scroll and the southern scroll, they have different interpretations. That somehow somebody here wrote that in there, and also there are nations listed in Noah which didn't exist till 1,000 years later.
So what do the Orthodox say about that?
It's oral.
The Orthodox will come up with a midrash that says that they saw in the future God, when God dictated to Moses, that God. So let's just leave it. Let's just leave the fact that there is something called the oral tradition. Here's what I wanted to get to before we actually go into the history of the Bar Mitzvah. 3,400 years ago, we get the Torah, and it says in the Talmud, which I'll get to in a second, Moshe Kibel Torah. Moses received Torah from Mount Sinai. Okay, anybody here something that he didn't get? Moses received Torah. What's the difference between the Torah and Torah? And you tell me. What's the difference between that?
I think the Torah refers to the specific volume that we study, and Torah may refer to a generalized discourse or set of oral tradition.
My Torah that I received was my grandfather, Nissen Ortenberg, of blessed memory, who taught me stop spending so much time in synagogue and go out and help me collect underwear for underprivileged children. That's my Torah. That's the Torah that I got from my Zaidi Olav Shalom. Or when I think most of you know the story, when we walked on the street and a drunk walked up to us in Montreal at age 8, and my Zaidi gave him $2, and I said, "What are you doing, Zaidi?" And he said, 5 people come up to me and need, I'm sure one of them needs it, and I don't know which one. I'd rather waste $8 to do 2. That's my Torah. And you teach Torah to Dana, and Dana teaches Torah to Danny, and you all teach Torah. That's what you got inside. You've raised a wonderful young man. You teach Torah. You think that you're not teaching heavy Judaism. You're teaching Torah. It's in your kishka. So this oral tradition, I think, goes from, you received it from your parents and your grandparents, and it's in you. And that's called the oral Torah. But the thing was that it was written down. There was a gap between 3400 BCE and approximately, and I'm going to do some erasing here.
That's more an ethical Torah that you're speaking of rather than a religious Torah.
When I'm giving you something called drash. Drash is interpretation. That's my job. When I give a sermon, right, or at your Passover table, you're giving some drash. You're giving some interpretation. But I see, and conservative Judaism says, it doesn't say Moses got the Torah. Moses got Torah. And Moses passed Torah to Joshua. And Joshua passed it to the elders. And the elders passed it to the Great Assembly, or the Great Assembly passed it to the elders. And the elders passed it to the rabbis. And the rabbis passed it to the grandparents and the parents. And Torah is the number one thing, even though you can't recite chapter and verse in the Torah. I'm going to tell you, as any of you here, you may not be Moses or Rashi or whatever. Does anybody question whether you have Torah in here somewhere? I'm going to tell you every one of you has Torah in here somewhere. And that's what we're going to focus on as we go. We're going to focus more on the values of Torah and the oral Torah. Time for a history lesson. Okay. All right, so in the 200 CE, anybody know what happens in the year CE, 70 CE?
The temple was destroyed.
The temple was destroyed. What's left? What's left?
The remnants, the wall.
Besides the rabbis. Yeah.
The remnants are visible.
What's the most important remnant that we have that's left?
The wall.
The wall. Right, okay. So, now, for example, the wall, the temple gets destroyed in approximately 70 CE. What is that? About, what are we talking here? About 2,000 years ago, right?
A year after Pompeii.
Right. Now,
Just to give a
here's how Torah works. Why was the temple destroyed? Why? Because one day the Romans got up and said, "These guys are too much trouble." Now, you think the rabbis are going to let this one sit still?
No.
So they tell a story of what's called Kamsa Bar Kamsa. Kamsa Bar Kamsa. There's 2 guys, and I forget which one it is. I think it's Bar Kamsa. In the 2,000 years ago, has a wedding, and he says to his assistant, "Don't invite," and I get the 2 mixed up. Don't invite Kamsa. Sorry, there's a gentleman who has a wedding, and he says to his guy Friday, "Invite everybody of the town in our circle, but don't invite so and so." Let's say it's Bar Kamsa, but he gets his invitations mixed up, and he invites Kamsa instead of Bar Kamsa. The 2 of them have had a fight in business, and they don't get along, and there's a big party, and all of a sudden the person says, the man says, who's sponsoring the wedding, says, "What is Bar Kamsa doing sitting over there? I told you to get rid of him. Now get him out of my wedding party." So goes over to says, "Look, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. You have to leave." And Bar Portnoy says, "I'm going to pay for half of the wedding. Look at my wife. She's dancing on the table. She's having such a good time. She's so happy. She doesn't get out much. Let her stay." And he goes back in front of the rabbis, and the guy says, "Get rid of him." Goes back, says, "I'll pay for the entire wedding." Goes back again. "I'll pay for the entire wedding and send them on a Caribbean cruise." And the guy says, no, get rid of him. And the story continues, but the rabbis say, why was the temple destroyed? Because of senseless hatred amongst Jews. So the rabbis always try to give us sort of a moral lesson. Again, that's called midrash or drash, and that's where we are. Okay, 270 CE, the temple is destroyed. 200